I have decided to take some inspiration from science fiction cult classic The Guyver and build myself a Guyver Unit. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with The Guyver initially started off as a Japanese comic book series, which then kind of grew and got fans and became a animated series by Booster Armour, which was sort of manga anime style. Not to everyone's taste, I will admit. Obviously, I know a lot of people I speak to have never even heard of the Guyver. They seem to get it confused with MacGyver, which is completely different. I kind of grew up as a kid. I liked this series with the Japanese anime version of it. There was also a live action movie, or a couple of live action movies, that was released, I think it was late 80s, kind of early 90s. The first one actually features Star Wars Mark Hamill. Don't be excited, he was only a kind of small part of the movie. He wasn't actually one of the main characters. Now, I'll be honest, I have always been a huge fan of the Guyver ever since I saw it when I was a kid, basically. And I have always kind of had a desire to have what's called the Guyver Unit.
Look out! Sure, you shouldn't touch that. This must be part of some machine that blew up.
There are a couple of different variations. There's the variation which is based on the comic books and the anime / manga, and there's also the live action version. I'll be honest, I have always been a bigger fan of the manga anime version than the live action movie version of this unit. I've always wanted to build one. From a design point of view, the Guyver Unit consists of three main elements. There's the internal biological organism, the protective outer casing, and the control module, which is effectively the computer that controls the unit. I've actually started to build a wooden structure using some plywood and some offcuts of wood. Now, I didn't have any specific guidelines onto what sort of size it was, so I had to look into some reference images and videos, anything I could get my hands on really. I also watched back through the cartoons as well, and I've got quite a few shots of that as well. I worked out that it's roughly about a foot in diameter. Thickness wise, it's around about sort of 5-6 inches thick, so you can actually pick it up. And that's the sort of size that I am going for. This is actually going to be the final piece. And as you can see, it's fairly large. And it's got some wires hanging out of it because it's going to have some electronics and some lights and hopefully some sound effects as well. When I first started planning building a Guyver unit, the first thing I started to think about was the control module in the centre of the unit. It consists of a shiny metal orb sat on top of a light ring. This is then encased in a chrome unit which is embedded into the full Guyver unit. I actually came across the perfect outer casing to the control module when I discovered these coffee lids. I felt that this was absolutely perfect in shape and size for the dome to sit in. I then began my search for the perfect semisphere to insert into this casing. I wanted to make sure that it fits nice and snugly and looks like one complete unit. Whilst I was trying to find the perfect dome for the control module, I even tried one of the balls from my son's ball pit. It actually fits almost perfectly. However, the plastic that's used for these is very, very flimsy, and it's subject to being dented, and it really doesn't hold up very well. So I decided against using this and went back to the drawing board. I realised that the LED bulb fits absolutely perfectly into the lid from the coffee cup, and it creates an almost perfect control module shape. I was very, very happy with this. I decided that if I was to use an LED bulb, it might be worth creating the Guyver unit as an actual lamp that I could just plug into the wall and switch on and off. I even went as far as going to my local B&Q store and buying a lamp holder for the bulb. Now please note, B&Q don't sponsor the channel, but if anyone is watching from B&Q and you do fancy sponsoring the channel, get in touch, eh? I eventually decided against creating a Guyver unit lamp, simply because I wanted the light to be able to fade in and out, and I also wanted to include some sound effects as well, something that I wasn't going to be able to do with a simple lamp, which would just switch on and off. However, if you are interested in me creating a lamp, then please leave a comment down below, as it's a future project that I could possibly do on the channel. So, bye-bye to that. Hello to that. When I was putting together the control model, I decided that the best effect would be if I removed the dome from the LED light bulb and hot glued it into place in the coffee lid. As you can see, it fits absolutely perfectly, and it looks like one completely solid piece. Even without the hot glue, it fits really well into shape, and it takes quite a bit to remove it. Once I had finished assembling the control model, I then started to consider how I was going to light it. I initially considered using some LED lights to light up the inside of the Guyver unit. I'll be honest, I wasn't particularly happy with the lighting that they emitted. I wanted to make it glow really brightly, like it does in the anime series. However, after a random trip to my local pound shop, I discovered a 360-degree orb cob light. At only £2, I felt that this was an absolute bargain, and even if I didn't use it for this particular model, I'm sure it would come in very handy in the future. When I got it home, I disassembled it. I was very impressed to find that it contained a very small but very bright LED, which I could use for the model, and decided that this was going to be the base of the illumination for the control model. I realised I could also dim this light as well, something which you can't do with other LED bulbs. Absolutely perfect, because I wanted the light to fade in and out. In addition, it also contained a base which contains a small magnet, perfect for holding the cob light in place. I felt that this could be a really good way of completing the model and attaching it to a display case or base. Once I had finished assembling the control model and I was happy with it, I then decided that I wanted to paint it. I did have a go at this before off camera, and the results were, well, less than impressive. As you can see, the paint is pretty blotchy. I'll be honest, I left it not long enough before I started touching it, leaving big fingerprints all over it. I did try and salvage it, and unfortunately I didn't really do a very good job of it. So I'm not going to be using this one, but I'm going to be repainting the one I've just created. Having already failed miserably to paint the control model, I decided to practice before I painted the new one. I tried spraying a couple of plastic domes with the chrome spray paint and leaving them for a good 48 hours before going anywhere near them. I'll be honest, I am a lot happier with the finish on my practice test piece than I was on my original control model. It has come out really nice and shiny, it's nice and reflective, and it doesn't have any kind of imperfections like this one does. Now if you are interested, I am using the Plasticoat Brilliant Metallic Spray Paint. The reason I bought it is because I was looking for a highly polished chrome finish, and obviously the cap led me to believe that that was the kind of finish that I was going to be getting. However, having tested it, it's not as shiny as I was expecting. It's not as reflective, and it's a little bit more dull. It's not quite the effect I was looking for. Now, if you are using spray paints and you've got any experience using any kind of chrome finish that comes out a little bit better than that, please, by all means, let me know any recommendations down below in the comments. I would be interested to know if I can get something that looks more reflective and more shiny, more mirror-like. Is anything better than anything else? Let me know. And hopefully I can maybe get something a little bit better than this before I come to actually paint the model.
Sure, you shouldn't touch that. This must be part of some machine that blew up. But what is this strange thing inside? It looks like some kind of creature.
When it came to the biological side, I felt that there was two ways in which this was portrayed in previous examples of the Guyver. The animated series reminded me of maybe internal organs or intestines or worms, something that was very much alive. However, looking at the live action version, I felt that the Guyver unit was too clinical. The internal biological element seemed to just be cable, in my opinion. I felt that that wouldn't really portray something that potentially is alive. So when I designed my unit, what I wanted to do was emulate internal organs. I wanted something a little bit more natural. So what I did was I had a look online, and I found that Pinterest, for example, is a really good source of imagery. And I wanted to look at intestinal type of organs, nerves, and just general muscle kind of textures to kind of get an idea of what I wanted to create. Once I had decided how I wanted the internal element to look, I then started to look for materials that would allow me to create something that looked like I wanted it. I had several ideas of using maybe a rope or some string. However, I'll be honest, looking at it, it didn't look like anything other than rope or string. The texture, although it was interesting, didn't look like anything natural. It looked like a woven material, which wasn't going to be suitable for what I wanted it to do. I did see some corrugated tubing, which was more in line with what I wanted, and I really liked that kind of texture. However, there was very little available in the sort of size that I wanted. So I decided that I wanted to maybe try different methods, and that's where I came up with the idea of using some air drying clay. Similar to Das clay, which I've got here. I felt that I could maybe create the internal biological aspect of the Guyver unit, a natural intestinal string or long sausage or worm, using that. So I had to play around. I'll be honest, the first attempt, I don't feel it has that real kind of like texture that I'm after. I wasn't really happy with it. Then I came up with the idea of using some corrugated card and rolling the clay on that. Once I had tried that, I was actually very impressed. It turned out really, really well. And I feel that if I was to create some worms, that's definitely the way forward. Once I stuck it down, it looked really good. But the main concern I've got, well, the two main concerns I've got is, one, it will have to be glued down really, really heavily onto the unit with a layer of the clay, and that I feel could make the unit really quite heavy. I'm also concerned about when it dries, whether it cracks. It is a really good effect, and I really do think it would be effective, but I'm not sure if this is the final effect that I really want to use. Ironically, as I was working on this piece, I came across an idea in which I used my glue gun. Now, as you can see, there is some sort of almost biological shapes there, and I feel that maybe a glue gun would work. So I'm going to try something along those lines. When I tried to apply the glue from the hot glue gun, I found out that it didn't really keep its shape very well. As it dried, it tended to naturally smooth out into a puddle rather than stay as individual strands. I gave it a rub with my finger to see if I could roughen it up again. However, all I ended up with was a bit of a mess which didn't look good at all. So back to the drawing board I went. And whilst looking through some drawers in my kitchen, I actually found some spare washing line. Now, what made me consider using the washing line initially was actually the colour. It was pink, which I thought was very close to the right colour for the internal biological organism of the Guyver unit. I set about creating another test piece using the washing line and hot glue gun. It actually worked really well, and I was very pleased with the results. Although the washing line was not ribbed like the second clay test piece that I'd produced, I felt that the combination of washing line and the globular glue from the hot glue gun actually worked better than the clay. I actually found that the washing line and hot glue was also a lot easier to apply to my test piece than I found with the clay. Once I had finished my test pieces, I also wanted to try some painting techniques as well, to see if I could create the sort of effect that I'm looking for. There was two painting techniques that I did want to try on these models. One was using an airbrush, and the other painting technique was to dry brush the model. I started with my test piece, which was created using a combination of the washing line and the hot glue gun. I felt that this was going to be more promising. However, I did feel that before I painted it, it would need to be primed. As I wasn't entirely sure which painting technique would provide the best outcome, I decided to create a second test piece, and then I primed both of them, one using black primer and one using white. I do think that certainly with the first one, I've kind of allowed a little bit too much of the glue just to kind of like peel off and that sort of thing before I have painted it. It really doesn't look particularly neat. It looks really rough, whereas with the black painted one, obviously I've done it a little bit more neater, and I do feel that that works a lot better. Although you don't initially see it, once you've actually painted it, even with a primer, you can see every nasty little bit of hot glue that sort of sticks out, and it really doesn't make the model look very good. Now, I was thinking about that, and I might use a bit of a heat gun or something like that on the model before I paint it for the actual model itself, just to make sure that all of the glue is kind of smooth rather than jaggy out, sticky out bits. As I want to try two different painting techniques on two different colours, rather than creating another couple of test pieces, I thought I may as well just use some masking tape and mask up just half the model, and that way I can compare them side by side. It's not ideal, especially considering that the model is obviously 3D and it's not going to mask properly. If I was really bothered about it, I could take some more time, use some liquid mask and actually work on it properly, but considering these are only really small test pieces, I'm not really that bothered. Starting on the test pieces I had created using the washing line and hot glue, I decided a dry brush technique would be an ideal place to begin. From a selection of several paints that I thought would be suitable, I started to paint the test piece using some amethyst acrylic paint. I liked the colour and I felt it was fairly close to what I wanted. By applying a tiny amount of paint to the brush, then using a cloth to wipe off the excess, I was able to cover the highlights of the model test pieces in the amethyst paint. I then went back over the model using a rose pink acrylic paint to give some extra texture and shading. After the initial dry brush, I definitely feel that the black primer works best. The purple seems to cover it really nicely, and although you can't really see it in the light on the camera, it does actually look really effective. With the white primer, however, I don't feel that this works anywhere near as effective. The colours on top are just too vibrant. It's not the effect I'm looking for. I definitely feel that black primer is the colour choice that I should be using before I come to paint it. However, before I made my final decision, I thought that I should have some fun experimenting with my airbrush. Now, I'll be honest, I didn't quite have the colours that I wanted to use for this. The closest I've got is a rust colour hull red. I may mix it with some white as well, just to get the effect that I'm wanting. Once I'd finished painting the test pieces, I then went on and just used the rest of the paint that I had left in the airbrush and painted over the models that I'd made with the clay. It was more of a test really, just to see how well the clay was going to take. I didn't really put much effort into it. Just generally, overall, the clay wasn't really giving me anywhere near the aesthetic kind of qualities that I was looking for. I felt that the material could end up being quite brittle and fragile, and I wanted a fairly hard wearing unit that I could pick up and move around without having to worry about chunks chipping off or bits breaking. So I decided against using that. Even now, several weeks later, when I look back at my test pieces, I still feel that the glue gun and washing line is more organic than what I've achieved with my clay. I feel that this matches the internal biological organisms of what a Guyver unit is. So therefore, I've decided that this is going to be the method that I use for my final piece. As a final test, I decided to go to my local boys store here in the UK, and I bought myself a couple of Vallejo model colour acrylic paints, one in purple and one in royal purple. To the untrained eye, they do look the same shade, and they actually look the same shade as the amethyst. However, I wanted to try and get the sort of purple shades that was featured in the Manga cartoon, and I thought I'd give these two a go. I repainted the test piece off camera, just with a quick dry brush using these three paints, and let it dry. I must admit, I am a lot happier with the colours of the test piece now that I've repainted it. I feel that it definitely matches what I was looking for initially, and these I've decided are going to be the colours that I'm going to be using for the final model. Once I had made my final decision, I then started to attach the washing line to the actual model using exactly the same method. I was very pleased with the initial result, and even without painting I felt that it gave off the exact aesthetics that I was looking for, and it looked genuinely like a Guyver unit. I needed to complete the biological element of the unit. I'd already finished the back, so I needed to finish the front and also the sides. I used my hot glue gun to stick washing line to the structure. I felt that this method was working out really well so far. It was coming out exactly as I planned, and I felt that it was giving me the aesthetic that was depicted in the manga versions of the Guyver series. One downfall I found, however, was that I was going through a lot of hot glue sticks. I was actually starting to wonder if I had enough on hand to complete what I wanted to do on the model. also needed to finish the biological organism on the sides of the unit. The main problem was these bits of wood. As you can see, there is a big gap between them. The main issue that I had was trying to get the washing line on the sides to go round in a curve rather than just follow the contours of the wood. I decided that one of the easiest ways to do this was simply to use a few sheets of cardboard. I cut some strips of cardboard to the same width as the unit. In order for them to curve around the unit, I cut down all of the corrugations in the card. This allowed me to add a nice smooth curve rather than having the cardboard fold unevenly. I also decided to add a little bit of padding onto the wooden blocks that I'd used to build the structure. The padding was basically made using 2-inch square pieces of cardboard. I also glued on another smaller rectangle of cardboard just to help add to the curve. I pre-built these and then I attached them using more hot glue to the sides of the structure. These extra padding pieces just helped me to make sure that when I was attaching the sides, they remained round. Once I had finished attaching the cardboard to the side of the unit, I then continued adding more washing line using the hot glue. I definitely feel that attaching the washing line is the most long-winded way of doing it. It's taken forever. And I've still got to finish this bit here. Sadly, it's about 1:30 in the morning and I've just ran out of washing line, so I'm going to have to stop it now and go and get some sleep because my throat's killing me and carry on another day. I'm also going to have to get some more glue sticks because this is taking up a lot of glue, hot glue. So yeah, I'm going to have to go back to the pound shop and get some more because I'm getting low. I'm pleased with it so far. So really good. The following day, I visited my local pound shop to stock up on more washing line and some more hot glue. Although I wanted to make sure I had enough hot glue to finish off the model, I decided that I didn't want to appear to be too greedy. That evening I finished attaching the rest of the washing line to the sides of the model off camera. For the front of the unit, I created a separate insert out of polystyrene. As the front of the unit tapers inwards towards the control medal, I simply cut away a shape so that it was beveled on the inside, and then left a hole where I will be installing the control medal. The idea is that this insert will be inserted into the model once the electronics have been installed. I will then use some magic trickery in order to hide any visible seams before painting and completing the model. So far, I must admit that I am extremely happy with how well the model is turning out. I feel that the washing line and the hot glue combination has worked out very, very well. It's given me the aesthetics I'm looking for, and also, as a bonus, it's actually quite a nice piece to touch. It's very tactile. It's got a very interesting texture as well. It's also very sturdy as well, and I don't have to worry about breaking it. I'm now extremely excited about seeing this piece put together with the control medal, the lights and the sounds, and also the outer protective casing. Can't wait to see it all painted up. Now, speaking of painting, I decided to try using some alternative spray paint. This one I bought for £4.99 from Aldi here in the UK. Again, it's promising a mirror-like finish, but I thought I'd give it a test. Maybe go head to head and see what turns out the best. In order to compare each of the paints, I decided to make up some test boards using some cardboard and some plastic spoons. Using masking tape, I attached 2 spoons to each sheet of cardboard, making sure I noted which primer I was using for each of the tests. I used white, grey and a black satin spray paint underneath the chrome finishes. I wanted to see if that helped with the reflective properties of the chrome spray paints. In addition, as a control test, I left one of the pairs of spoons unprimed as well. I then gave each pair of spoons a coating in a different primer, making sure that they were covered evenly. Once the primers had dried, I then took it in turns to paint each one of them with a different chrome paint to see if there was any difference. And I wanted to see if it was possible to get a finish that looked like the mirror finish as promised on the lids. I also needed to find out if there was a specific formula to follow in order to get the finish that I was looking for. Now, when you are coming to use any kind of spray paint, either in a tin or using an airbrush, it's always best to try and ventilate your area as best as possible. Ideally, you would have a dedicated spray booth. Unfortunately, I don't have one set up, so I'm just going to open the door. Just makes it a little bit more safe rather than inside the shed. Looking at the final results, it's actually quite surprising. I've noticed that the Easy Home silver paint, which is actually cheaper than the one I bought from Aldi, performed a lot better than the Plasticoat Brilliant Metallic finish. Overall, the Easy Home paint is a lot more reflective than the Plasticoat. It's also quite surprising to note that the primer used didn't really have much of an effect. Ironically, I feel that the test piece, without any primer, actually performed slightly better than the others. Although it doesn't actually show particularly well on camera, there is a noticeable difference between the two finishes. Obviously, these are only a comparison between 2 different spray paints. I am aware that there are various other brands available, some of which may or may not perform better than the ones I already have. This cap is not an exact representation of the finish that can be achieved with this product. Unfortunately, I don't have the time or the budget to purchase a wide range of spray paints at this particular moment and compare them. However, if you are interested in seeing that in a future video, drop me a comment down below and let me know. Perhaps I can find a sponsor who would be interested in putting forward some of this paint and I can do a really good bench test. Having noted the results of these 2 paint comparisons, I have made the final decision to use the Aldi Easy Home paint to spray the control medal. I'm not going to use any primer, I'm going to just spray the paint directly onto the model. In order to make sure that I have a light ring around it, I have purchased some thin masking tape and applied this around the bottom of the dome. I'm going to leave this until the paint dries before removing it. This will then leave a gap for the light to emit from. Once I had made my final decision, I then used the paint and sprayed the control medal. Whilst allowing it to dry, I made a dust cover using some cardboard and my cutting mat. Hopefully, this will prevent any dust getting to the paint while it's drying. Unlike the first attempt, I am not going to touch this for about 3 or 4 days. I'm going to make sure the paint is completely dried before I even attempt to go near it. I do not want to make the same mistakes that I made on the first attempt of my control medal. A couple of days later, it was the moment of truth. Removing the cardboard from around the control medal was slightly nerve-wracking. My previous attempt, as I mentioned, had been atrocious, and I was very worried that it wouldn't look anywhere near as good as I was hoping. However, I was extremely pleased with the final outcome. The alternative spray paint I've used has actually done the job very, very well. The finish is extremely reflective and it looks amazing. So now that I've finished painting the control model and I've left it to dry, I think I should focus on the electronics that are going inside the unit. I wanted to install some electronics. I wanted the control model to light up, and I want some sound effects on the model as well. This is where I started playing around with the Arduino Nano microprocessor. Now, I'd never used the Arduino set before, and this is the first project in which I've used any kind of electronics to this extent. Therefore, I had to look everything up online. Luckily, YouTube is a very, very good resource on how to begin and get started with the Arduino set, and there are hundreds if not thousands of tutorials available. One of the benefits of using Arduinos in projects such as this is that it's very inexpensive and accessible. Despite having very limited experience in programming, I found the software very easy to use and understand, and after maybe about 20 minutes or so from beginning, I actually had a flashing LED light. Now, I know that that doesn't sound particularly exciting by itself, but when you come from a pretty much non-existent programming background and you manage to get some LEDs flashing, it is actually very rewarding. I soon realised that if I wanted to include some sound effects, it was best to add an additional MP3 player module to my setup, and it really helped to bring my idea of this model to life. It was also a good time to invest in a few small cheap electronics, such as a breadboard, a set of jumper wires, and the rest of it I pretty much scavenged from bits I had lying around the house. The LEDs that I used were recycled from an old set of Christmas tree lights, and the speaker was from a pair of broken wireless headphones. I also decided to include the previously built control model and the lighting that I was using as a way of encouraging myself to focus on the project. Seeing the control model light up and fade and hear the sound effects at the same time was very exciting, and it gave me a good indication of how the final project would actually turn out. In addition, my two youngest children, Nathan, who's 3, and my daughter Michaela, who's 12, both took a keen interest in the electronics as well. Nathan found it incredibly exciting to press the buttons and set the lights off and hear the sounds. And my daughter was interested in creating a traffic light system using 3 coloured LEDs, a little project that I did on the side. Now, if you are a parent yourself and you are interested in getting your children involved in any kind of electronic projects that are fairly easy to start with, then I would definitely recommend looking into the Arduino sets. Now, what I will do is I will post some links down below in the description to get you started, and also some links to items that you can buy fairly cheaply on eBay or Amazon. In the Manga version of the Guyver, the outer casing of the Guyver unit appears to be made up of some solid metallic material, and I knew that I wanted to emulate that as closely as possible on my model. For the outside protective casing of the model, I had always planned on using some sheets of EVA foam. I took to YouTube for some inspiration and some research, and after watching several cosplay and costume building channels, I realised that the foam is actually a very, very good choice. It can be easily shaped, it can be stuck together, and it can be formed into the shapes that I wanted.
Why couldn't that all?
The first thing I needed to do was work out exactly how the outer shell was going to be covering my Guyver unit. Unfortunately, at the time I didn't have access to a printer or kind of any way of getting a nice even spacing around the unit. I initially tried to mock up some templates using some barbecue skewers and some paper. However, I tried to work out the shape and the size without any kind of measurements, and it really wasn't working for me. So I decided to scrap that idea and go back to the drawing board. I realised that if I was going to do this properly, then I would probably have to use some sort of desktop publishing software. So I went on my computer and I used a vector-based graphics program. Using the software, I then created a pattern which I printed out onto some plain paper. Carefully cutting these paper template pieces out, I then transferred the design onto some EVA foam and then cut it out to use for the model. However, because of the thickness, or lack thereof, it was far too flimsy to use as a protective casing by itself. So I decided to replace that with some thicker EVA foam. I was under the impression that the best source of EVA foam was some mats that you can buy for putting on the floor. The problem is that what I bought wasn't EVA foam. This was actually PE foam, which is completely different. The thickness was about right, but unfortunately I soon realised I wouldn't be able to use the PE foam by itself. Having done some quick tests off camera, I realised that there was a possibility that I could use the thin EVA foam on top of the PE foam if I used some contact cement to glue them together. By having the EVA foam on top, it allows me to shape and sculpt the model, and the PE foam underneath provides the rigidity that I was looking for. I feel that all is not lost with this combination. I took some time and mocked up part of the outer casing using the combination of PE and EVA foam. I must admit I was pleasantly surprised with how well it turned out. Although still quite rough, I feel that by the time I include some sanding and some filling and painting, it might look quite effective. And it's a technique that I plan on developing further. A word of warning, if you are using a contact adhesive such as this one or anything similar, then please make sure that you follow all of the safety precautions provided in the instructions. Adhesives, such as these ones, can emit toxic vapours or fumes, which can, at best, cause irritation to your breathing, and at worst, can be extremely fatal. Always make sure that you work in a well-ventilated area and use appropriate breathing apparatus, such as a gas mask or respirator. Please note that dust masks, such as this one, are designed to prevent particles from entering your lungs. However, they may not prevent you from breathing in toxic fumes. As always, enjoy making your models, but be safe at the same time. After practicing my technique off camera and giving myself a stern talking to regarding health and safety, I felt a lot more confident and forged ahead creating the foam pieces for the outer casing. Once I'd finished creating the basic outer shell, it looked awesome, but there were still some final tweaks to make. If you look closely, there are edges that don't line up, there's seams that don't match, and it looks a little bit bodged together. The urge to start hacking away at the uneven seams at this stage is very strong, which I'm a little bit concerned about. However, I do have a plan. What I'm going to do is I'm going to file it all down, I'm going to fill any gaps and basically make it look all nice and neat before I do any painting. I am going to adopt a few different methods for this, including using some filler, some sanding. I'm also going to carve some away using a rotary tool and just basically play around until I get everything looking very, very neat, very tidy and ready for painting. I thought that before I started to take sharp knives, sandpaper and power tools to my carefully constructed foam pieces, I should probably have a bit of a practice, get used to the techniques and work out how it's going to work on the final pieces. During the construction, I mocked up some smaller test pieces as well, using exactly the same techniques. My plan is to use these test pieces to practice filling in any gaps, sanding it down and shaping it so that it looks as I want it. Once I've built up my confidence enough using these test pieces, I will then move on to my model and finish tidying up all of the foam pieces on the actual model itself. Another benefit of having smaller test pieces is that when it comes to the painting, I can try some techniques out first before simply diving in and applying paint straight to the model. It pretty quickly became apparent that the sandpaper and the file were both pretty useless when it came to removing excess material from the foam. The sandpaper was very poor at providing a nice clean edge on the foam, although good for preparing a surface, left the edges and the corners slightly furry, which is not a good look for a model. The file again left edges with torn corners and torn edges, which again is not what I was looking for. In stark contrast, however, the rotary tool was incredibly effective at removing large amounts of excess material from the foam. The main issue I had with the rotary tool is I found it was actually quite difficult to maintain any accuracy when trying to remove the material. In one area I actually managed to cut through to the PE foam which was underneath, something that I wasn't planning on doing. I also started to try the sealant to find out how effective that was. With a little bit of water, it went on incredibly well and provided very smooth edges. Now obviously I have to wait for this to dry in order to get a final result, but I'm feeling very confident about this so far. With regards to how I am going to be proceeding with my Guyver unit and the foam pieces for this, I do feel that a combination of the rotary tool and the decorator's cork is going to be the most effective way I can get a nice finish and a smooth surface. Better get on with it. Despite having practiced a few times on the test pieces, I was still initially quite reluctant to start carving away at the outer casing pieces. I didn't want to cause any damage after the amount of time that I'd spent building them. However, I did soon get into the flow of it, and I did realise quite quickly that using several passes of very light strokes to remove material was a lot more effective than heavier, more aggressive passes. The material comes off really nicely, and it allows me to produce very nice smooth rounded edges. Sanding using a rotary tool is incredibly messy. There is EVA dust or foam dust literally everywhere, all over the unit, all over the rotary tool, and it's all over me as well, which is one of the reasons I recommended wearing a mask. If you breathe this stuff in, it can be incredibly dangerous. Now, full disclosure, I was having a big issue with this because of my glasses. It was steaming up, so rather than using this one, I actually found a mask that I used back in 2020. I can't remember why I needed a mask in 2020, but I did, and obviously I was wearing this instead, which just reduced the steaming up on my glasses. So now all I need to do is tidy up, get rid of all of the dust particles off my rotary tool, my worktop, and all of these pieces here as well. Probably take a shower, and then I need to get on with filling everything so that I can make all of the edges and gaps nice and smooth for painting. Once I'd actually finished sanding, I then took the pieces indoors to use the filler. Taking the pieces inside actually gave my daughter and I a little bit of bonding time when we both worked together doing the filling of the gaps.
Better not harden, because if this hardens, it's all on my hand.
I must admit, now that they have been sanded down and smoothed down, they look a lot better than they did, and I can't wait to get them painted. When I was putting the control model together, I decided that I wanted light to emit from the ring at the bottom of the dome. However, one of the things I hadn't considered when I was building this model is light leakage. If you're not sure what that term means, it's basically when a model emits light from places that it shouldn't. I wanted to make sure that no light was going to be coming out of the unit anywhere other than this ring here on the control model. So as a test, I used some LED strip lights, put them in a model and tried switching them on. Unfortunately, the light emits really pretty badly. As you can see, most of the light is leaking from the front panel. The reason for this is because I used polystyrene as the modelling material, a material which doesn't block light, it simply diffuses it. So I'm going to have to address that before I complete the model. As well as light leaking out of the front, I noticed that there were some of the seams on the sides of the model, and I knew that I had to take care of those as well. This light leakage is an issue that could potentially really spoil all the hard work that's gone into the model, and I wanted to do something about it. Now luckily, I have already looked into light leakage and preventing it on a previous video that I made for my model railway channel. I made up some test pieces and filled them full of different materials to compare what material was going to be best for preventing light leakage. What I was planning on doing is, before I install all of the electronics, I will coat the inside, or as best as I can, anywhere where there is light leaking from the inside of the model. Hopefully this will then prevent the light from coming out of the model anywhere other than the control model. With the inside of the Guyver unit now sorted, I wanted to focus on the outer casing details. The design includes grooves that runs down the middle of the larger casing pieces and a small indent as well. I wanted to replicate these grooves and indents in the foam before painting, so I decided to once again try some techniques on my small test pieces. Using my rotary tool, I first started to carve out a groove in one of the pieces. I had seen several YouTube videos on how to create details in EVA foam, and a lot of them recommended applying heat to help any grooves expand and open up. So I decided to try using a naked flame. The results weren't wonderful, as some of the foam actually melted slightly. I then decided to try using a scalpel to carve a groove into the foam. I felt this looked a lot neater, but still wasn't exactly as I wanted. I decided that the scalpel would be a good place to start, and then I could use the engraving attachments on my rotary tool to provide the depth and gap that I was looking for. So I set to work carving grooves in my foam pieces. I took my time and used several different attachments until I had managed to remove the indents and create the grooves as I wanted. I then applied more heat, this time being a lot more careful to try and avoid burning the foam. Now all I needed to do was paint the model. When I came to painting the Guyver unit itself, the first thing I needed to do was prime it. So I used a grey primer and I sprayed the whole unit. I also sprayed the removable section of the unit as well, using the same grey primer. After the primer, I then sprayed the model in a matte black spray paint. It was quite exciting to see how dramatically the model changed, simply with the application of the black. The paint really tied everything together nicely, and made the model start to look as I had initially envisioned. Now I know what you're thinking, why did I use black spray paint? Well, I chose the black as it provided an excellent contrast to the purple shades I planned on using to create the biological element of the unit, similar to the test pieces I had created previously. I gathered the internal part of the model, along with acrylic paints in rose and amethyst, as well as some Vallejo model colour paints in purple and royal purple. I felt that a combination of dry brushing and airbrushing would help me to achieve the final look that I want. I initially decided to apply the amethyst as a general base colour to the biological element using the airbrush. As it was quite a thick acrylic paint, I started mixing a few drops with some thinner to thin it down and make it more suitable for my airbrush. Once thinned to a milk-like consistency, I then transferred the paint to my airbrush and started to paint the model. The paint was incredibly subtle on the black undercoat. It hinted at a purple sheen, which actually shows up here on the camera better than it did in person. Even after a few coats, the difference was pretty ineffective, so I decided to change tactics and try a dry brush technique instead. There was a lot of surface area to cover, so I used a 1-inch decorator's brush and started to apply the amethyst onto the black. The effect was instantly much more noticeable, and the colour really started to pop against the black. I applied a few layers on the model, however I wasn't being particularly neat as I wanted to build up the layers of colour in stages. I then applied a dry brush with the rose paint. The contrast of this shade worked incredibly well against the previous layer, and the details really began to show. For the first time, I felt as if the washing line actually started to look like the biological organism inside of the Guyver unit. I was very pleased so far. However, I continued to apply a dry brush over some of the individual bulges and veins using a mixture of the rose and amethyst. As a final touch, I then went back to my airbrush and using the model colour paint in the purple, started to add additional highlights to individual bulges and veins as well, to give the model more variety. The mixtures of purple shades along with the pinks worked incredibly well. I really feel that this paint job has helped me replicate the internal part of the Guyver unit in a pretty accurate way compared to the original source material. I feel that I have achieved what I set out to do. While the centre part of the model was drying, I then turned my attention to the outer casing made from the foam pieces. Before painting the foam pieces, I wanted to apply a mixture of 50% PVA and 50% water to seal all of the foam. I simply mixed it up in a large tub and then applied it fairly generously using a paintbrush. And then left it to dry, and then I could paint over it with the spray paint. When it comes to painting the outer casing, I have a couple of colour choices in mind. One of them is a midnight blue, which is a spray paint, and I also plan on using a metallic blue, which is a model paint. I am planning on using the Tamiya paint on top of any other paint that I use. I have done a quick test on top of a midnight blue, and as you can see, the metallic properties make this a very nice finish, which I think would work really well as the outer casing of the Guyver unit. The first step was to paint the base coat onto the foam. Using the midnight blue spray paint, I coated one of the larger foam casing pieces. The paint coverage was impressive and made easy work turning the blue foam blue. As I continued to paint the second piece, however, I noticed a difference in the textures between where the foam was bare and where the filler had been applied. It was then that I decided I should possibly use the grey primer on the foam pieces as well, to try and eliminate any difference in texture between the foam and the filler. The grey primer has certainly helped a little bit, but it's far from ideal. There is still a clear difference in the textures between where the filler has been applied and where the foam is just bare. I was kind of hoping that the PVA and water mixture would kind of cover up and seal it and make it all fairly uniform, but unfortunately I think I was putting too much hope into that method. I came to the conclusion that if I wanted a smooth, uniform finish, the best way would be to apply filler over the entire surface of the foam. To make it easier, I watered down some of the cork I had previously used and started to smooth it over the foam pieces. Once dried, the texture was much more consistent. I then gave the pieces a coat of primer before repainting them again with the midnight blue spray paint. Overall, I feel that the coat of filler over the entire foam has certainly improved the texture. If nothing else, it has certainly given a consistent finish to which I can apply the final coat of metallic blue paint to. Once the midnight blue spray paint had dried, it was then time to apply the Tamiya metallic paint over the top. I set up a temporary spray booth in my kitchen, mixed up some metallic blue paint and thinner, and started to apply it with my airbrush. Even though the paintbrush was applying a fairly good coverage, it didn't really give me the effect I was looking for. I was hoping for something a bit more reflective, However, the paint that was being applied looked a bit dull. I decided to switch tactics once again, and instead of using the airbrush, I turned to a brush to apply the paint instead. The metallic effect appeared much better using this technique instead. I pretty quickly discovered that by using a stippling effect with the metallic paint, I could achieve a worn and weathered look with several shades and variations appearing with very little effort. I must admit I loved this look. I always imagined that a Guyver unit, forged at the beginning of time and having travelled across the vastness of the entire universe, would probably end up a little bit beat up and worn by the time it arrived on Earth. So this effect was absolutely spot on to what I was looking for. In fact, it looked even better than I had originally hoped. Ever since I first decided that I wanted to build a Guyver unit, I knew that I wanted to include lighting and sound effects as well. Early research into the electronics for this project led me down the road to the Arduino Nano microprocessor, which could control everything. As I mentioned previously, I found a nice LED from a LED cob light, and I included a DF player to incorporate some sound effects as well. I managed to get a circuit put together that worked pretty much as I wanted. However, that was several months ago. Since then, I have dismantled the circuit, played around with loads of different circuits, played around with loads of different programming, and I'll be honest, I can't remember what I did back in the early days of the project. Yeah, it wasn't until I saw this video here that I started to wonder if I could actually bypass any of the programming and build a much simpler circuit without the Arduino instead. Once I'd finished playing around with the circuit on the breadboard, I soon discovered that if I connect the LED light directly to the speaker out of the DF player, then it would actually light up at the same time as playing the audio. Which was exactly what I wanted. Now, you're probably watching this video screaming at the screen saying, you cannot do this, you cannot connect an LED to the output of a MP3 player module, it won't work, it's gonna blow up and that sort of thing. And you might be right. However, it seemed to work. The reason I wanted to use the Arduino Nano was because in my initial idea I wanted a button press that would activate the light and sound. I also wanted to use a button to toggle and switch between different sound effects. So one, for example, when the unit is firing up, one when it's sat in its dormant state and it's just active pulsing, and one when it wants to shut down. When it came to the sound effects, I did find quite a few online that I felt were very Guyver Unit-esque. Using Audacity, a free audio editing software that you can get online, I combined all of the sound effects I'd got to make a audio sequence that included the firing up of the Guyver unit, the pulse when it's online, and when it powers down again. I put that onto an SD card, installed it onto the MP3 player module, and played it back with the LED attached to it as well. And everything started to come together. It was at that point I got very, very excited because the whole project was finally coming together, and I just could not wait to get the electronics installed into the inside of the unit and get this project finished. I started to solder all of the components in place so that I can install them into the unit. My soldering skills, not the best, I'll be honest, but after a quick test, everything was working. When it came to powering the components, I also had that already organised, because on the back is actually 3 AAA batteries with an output of about 4.5 volts, which was actually powerful enough to power everything I needed. The electronics were actually being powered by the 3 AAA batteries, and everything was completely self-contained within the unit. All I needed to do was install it and I could finish the project. It was at that point something went badly wrong. Somehow I managed to short circuit the DF player MP3 module, and nothing would play from that point onwards. I also realised that the chip on the back was actually getting very, very hot. Obviously I wanted to complete this project, so I did order a new replacement MP3 module. However, because it was just prior to Christmas, obviously with New Year, and with shipping taking a lot longer than normal, it was estimated that it's not going to be delivered until about mid-January now. It's finally arrived! The parcel that I've ordered before Christmas is finally here, which means hopefully I can finish off all the electronics on my Guyver unit. Now, before I start installing these, I do want to finish off a few little touches on the outside as well. So here's me doing that. One of the things I realised that I need to finish on the unit is one of the larger outer casing pieces. As you can see, the piece that I've overlooked still has the texture of the foam showing through, which just doesn't match the other 2 larger pieces. I could leave it, but I'll be honest, now that I've noticed it, it is really bugging me, and I just want to make sure that everything looks fairly consistent across all of the units. So I am going to sort that out. The first thing I did was quickly remove it from the unit. I had only pinned it in place temporarily. I then mixed up a batch of decorator's cork and some water, mixed it all together, and then smeared it all over the piece of foam. Now, the plan wasn't to fill in any of the gaps, it was just simply to make sure that the outer casing looks nice and smooth when it dries. Once it had all dried, I then repainted it using the Midnight Blue spray paint before applying the Tamiya metallic blue paint with a paintbrush in the same method I'd used before. And now everything matches up lovely. All I need to do now is install it onto the unit. One more thing that I wanted to sort out was the insert on the internal organism. I found that because the insert wasn't actually the correct height, sometimes it would actually sink below where it should do. In order to rectify this, I used a very low-tech solution using some lollipop sticks and some tape to add a few little spacers on the insert. Now the insert will stay exactly where it's supposed to. For the internal organism, I was really happy with the paintwork. It looked absolutely spot on. But one thing I did want is to have a slightly wet looking finish, because I felt that the internal organism would mimic internal organs, and by it being dry it just didn't quite look exactly how I wanted it. I decided to apply Vallejo gloss varnish over most of the model. I wanted the gloss to be very subtle, so I didn't apply a huge amount, only a very thin coat using an airbrush. Even though the gloss varnish by itself was quite thin, I decided to water it down slightly, just using a few drops of water. Once it was mixed, I was able to coat the entire internal organism with the gloss varnish in probably about half an hour. The difference that the gloss varnish has made to the internal organism is night and day. It's only a very small touch that I've applied to this, but I think that it has really tied it all together very nicely. The paint job that I already done was, in my opinion, pretty good already, but with the application of the gloss varnish, it really did pop. It really stood out, and it looks so much more effective. I am so happy that I decided to apply the gloss varnish on top of all of the rest of the paint, just to get that extra sheen on the organism. I do think that it works really well, and it'd be also really interesting to know what you think. Let me know in the comments down below. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. Another piece that I wanted to finish off was the control medal. Now, I had sprayed it with a nice chrome finish, and it looked really good in the beginning, but it's starting to dull, just with the wear and tear and handling as well. I also noticed that around this ring here, where I want the light to emit, some of the paint had kind of dripped down when I painted it, and it just looked a little bit messy, and I wanted to tidy that up before applying it to the final model. I also wanted to make sure that the nice chrome finish actually matched the piece I was planning on using for the back as well. Now, you won't actually see this piece will be underneath the unit, and it's actually got a magnet inside which connects to the base, which is going to hold it in place. But I still want it to look nice and chrome and shiny as well. The first thing I had to do was remove all of the old paint. Finding some old terps in my shed, I decided to give that a go. Using a cloth and a quick splash of it, it started to remove the paint very quickly and very easily, giving a very nice clean smooth finish. I also removed all the paint from the back sphere as well, using the same method. I discovered that not all of the paint was coming off, however. There was some slight pieces that were left on there where the paint had settled quite thickly. I decided to try some gel nail polish remover to see if that removed the last of the paint. It did have an effect, although I didn't clear all of it. However, by this point I decided that the paint I had removed and the paint that was left was still fine, because I was going to spray paint over it all anyway. Once I had finished removing all the paint as best I could, I then masked up the area where I want the light to emit from on the control medal, and then I gave both the front control medal and the back piece a spray using some chrome spray paint. Unfortunately, spray painting in the middle of January in the UK does have its drawbacks. I don't have a dedicated spray booth here in my shed, and unfortunately I'm basically having to spray outside. Reading the instructions, the spray paint says I should operate in temperatures of 16 to 25 degrees, which sounds lovely. However, I'm actually spraying in temperatures of about -2, which is not ideal. I'm hoping that the temperature is not going to have a huge detrimental effect on the paint finish, because I'll be honest, I don't have time to wait till summer when the temperatures get better, and I can't really spray it indoors either because my missus complains about the smell, which I don't blame her because apparently it stinks. Despite the freezing cold temperatures, I did press ahead, and I have now resprayed the control medal as well as the back piece of the control medal, which appears on the rear of the unit as well. And also I gave the little stand that it's going to sit in a gentle spray as well, just to tie it all nicely together. Hopefully the paint won't freeze or have any detrimental effect, and it will dry as I hoped, but we'll have to wait to see. Have you ever tried to spray anything outside? Have you ever had any good results, bad results? Please let me know in the description down below. I'm probably doing it completely wrong. Fair enough, I put my hands up to that, but I'm literally working with what I have, which is a small table just outside the shed, which is currently covered in frost and snow and ice. And I think I've seen a woolly mammoth out there as well, actually. Now, I have to wait in real time, but through the magic of editing, here we go. Once I had finished respraying the control medal, going back to it, I'll be honest, I wasn't hugely impressed. The finish wasn't as shiny as I had remembered it being the first time that I painted it. I got to a point where I thought that, do you know what, I'm just going to have to accept my fate, and that's going to be the final finish on the model. But then I came across this video by Mechs and Monsters on YouTube, and I'll put a link in the description below. In the video, he describes a different way of creating chrome using graphite powder, and this piqued my interest.
Just keep buffing and buffing and buffing, and you'll literally see it just start to sheen and shine, and like that is a proper nice chrome.
Having watched the video several times through, I decided that this might be an alternative method of getting a nice shiny control medal to look how I wanted it. So I gave it a go. Before I let loose on the actual model itself, I decided to do some tests, and what I'll do is I'll publish the results in that in a separate video, so look out for that. But I was really happy with the results, so I decided to press ahead and use the graphite powder to cover the control medal and hopefully get it nice and mirror-like and shiny. After quite a lot of applying graphite powder to the control medal, buffing it out and just generally polishing it up, I have basically ended up with a control medal which I feel really wasn't the effect I wanted, even with the graphite powder. Now, I must be honest, I think that the issue with the graphite powder is down to my application of it rather than the actual technique itself. I started to notice items with highly shiny, polished, reflective surfaces when I was out and about visiting various shops. It made me reconsider the control medal, and I decided that if I really wanted the best results, the best thing to do would be completely start from scratch. As I was putting some of our Christmas decorations away, I had another eureka moment. In the decorations box, I actually found a very large, very shiny and reflective bauble. Unknown to my missus, the bauble very quickly found its way into my collection of bits and bobs, put aside especially for this project. Off camera, I used a rotary tool and carefully cut it in half, only to discover it didn't quite fit over the dome. I spent a frustrating evening playing around to see if I could rework the control medal, and eventually chose to mount the half bauble on a slightly smaller light bulb dome, mounted just inside the outer casing. I used the lid from a bottled fruit drink to diffuse the LED light inside the dome and hot glued it all into place before attaching the entire control medal component into the inner part of the unit, making sure it was aligned with the internal organism. So now that I have completed the outer casing, the control medal and the internal organism, all that's left to do is apply the electronics and let's get this Guyver unit finished. When I ordered my DF player replacement back in December, I actually ordered two, just one as a spare just in case anything happened. I didn't fancy waiting for another 3 to 4 weeks to have to replace it if the worst came to the worst. The first thing I did was I opened the package and gave both DF players just a quick test using a breadboard to make sure that they both worked. Both of them worked fine, which was great, and there didn't seem to be any problems with either of them. It was then time to start connecting all of the wires. Using a soldering iron and some solder, basically I reconnected the speaker and the LED to the same output, which is these ones here. I then soldered all of the connections together as in this diagram. Once all of the connections had been made, it was then time to actually install them into the unit. The push switch I had decided to apply to make sure it was as obscured as possible. Taking a small drill to the unit, I carefully drilled a couple of holes to feed the wires through. Once the outer casing pieces had been replaced, it was pretty much impossible to spot unless you knew you were actually looking for it. One of the things I did notice is that when I leave the power supply connected to the DF player and it's not in use, it does start to cause some issues. The DF player starts to make random noises and sound effects, and I think that that's just one of the glitches of a constant power supply being fed into a device that doesn't really have an automatic off switch. So in order to combat that, I decided that I wanted to include a hidden on-off switch in the unit as well, so that I could prevent power from travelling to the DF player when the unit's not being used. To do this, I drilled a small hole in the side of the battery compartment and using my rotary tool to make sure that the hole was large enough to install the switch. This switch was simply soldered between the positive terminal of the battery compartment and installed into the unit. I then very carefully replaced the batteries and did a quick test of the unit. Success! It worked, and again it was playing the sounds and lights exactly as I had planned. I then finalised the model by dry fitting everything into place before finally attaching it with some hot glue. So, in what feels like my lifetime of work, I can now finally say my Guyver unit is finally complete. So now that it's complete, how do I feel about it? I'll be honest, I absolutely love it. I feel that some of the aspects of it have really worked well. For example, the blue metallic paint on the outer protective shell casing pieces has really worked out incredibly well, and so has the paintwork on the internal biological element of the unit. The control medal looks absolutely lovely, and I'm really pleased that I spent the extra time and effort to make sure that I got the high reflective qualities that I was looking for and didn't settle with the paint job. It's not perfect. There are a few little bits that I'm not 100% happy with. There is stuff that I could probably have done better, but I've got to the point where I need to draw a line and call it finished. Otherwise, I will work on this for the rest of my life. It has taken me a lot longer than I originally planned. I think I planned it for about 3 or 4 weeks as a build, but now it's taken me well in excess of a year. A lot of it has been down to my own procrastination, and I think that that's also added to my frustration on this project. If I was to rebuild this project again from scratch, then there are definitely things that I would look to improve on and also that I would do differently. I did have quite a steep learning curve on this one, and I must admit I'm glad that I went through it all, because now if I was to build it again, then there is definitely techniques that I would use and techniques that I would not use on a new build. Now, it would be really interesting to know your comments on the final Guyver unit as well. Do you feel that I have managed to recreate the Guyver unit accurately as depicted in the original manga or anime versions, or do you think that I've taken too much of a creative license with it? Some people have commented on the size of the unit. Is it too big? Is it too small? Please let me know. All of your comments and feedbacks will be read, and I do respond to every comment down below. I would like to also thank everybody who has been in contact with me. A few people have actually asked me, will I be doing a commission of this piece? And if so, let them know. I am considering it. Obviously, if you are interested in perhaps me putting a commission piece together for you, drop me an email. The email is in the description down below, and let me know. It's certainly something I can discuss with you, and I'll be happy to maybe have a chat with you about that if you are interested in me commissioning a Guyver unit for you. In the meantime, I will be taking a break from the Guyver, and I will be focusing on other science fiction based projects. So don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out, and I will see you again very soon. Thanks for watching.